Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. We are changing it up a bit today. Jamie's out sick, so my husband, Matt, who has also guest starred on a couple of our podcasts, is filling in here. So
I am pinch hitting. Hello, everybody.
Yes, we appreciate you filling in this time around. Jamie is going to record her piece of the Judgement, so you'll hear her later on, but in conversation, it will be Matt and I. This is Aaron. He's going to help me talk through our judgment of our Dueling Villains, John Brown and Aaron Burr. We approach the end of our series, and now it's time to do a little wrap-up and decide who's worse. Are you ready to judge with me?
I am going to say that I guess I am ready, but this runs really counter to my own philosophy when it comes to exploring history. I'm very reluctant to ever just bring the hammer down one way or the other. I know it's annoying, but I guess it's just kind of the curse of being a classroom teacher. I want my students to come to their own conclusions, but I'm trapped in the studio.
Sorry.
You've got me tethered to the microphone.
You gotta give opinions.
You do have a lot of leverage as my spouse, so.
You've got to give opinions. You can't get out of it this time.
So there's all sorts of on the other hands, but then again.
Well, we'll do a lot of that.
There's a whole phrase book I'm just going to have to throw into the fireplace.
You've heard our judgments. We do a lot of that, so you're going to be very at home here.
Okay. Well, I have to confess, though, I don't really know. I've listened to every podcast religiously, but the judgment format, I'm not totally fluent in.
Typically, we do a scale. We do like 100 scale. So you could say 30% bad, 70% good. In this instance, we're going more towards, since there are two of them, which do you think is the worst villain? Who do you think comes out better if we're comparing the two? We talked about in the podcast, there are some strong similarities between John Brown and Aaron Burr. And this is where I will stop and say, if you have not listened to those episodes, this will not make sense unless you're very schooled in Aaron Burr and John Brown. So I would recommend to go back, rewind, go back, and
we'll wait. We'll just pause right here.
We
will let you go grab that episode and come back.
It'll be a while.
We'll just wait.
There's a couple. You know me, the Aaron Burr one.
Oh, that's a two-parter, isn't it? Yeah.
Your girl can't edit.
Who goes first then?
Out of us.
Well, yeah.
I think it'll be more in conversation. We have talked about this in the lead up to it previously. I think at the heart of it is boiling it down to John Brown and Aaron Burr's worst moments. Both of them commit murder. Brown's murders are greater in number.
We could just put it crassly and say he has a higher body count.
He does have a higher body count. But you have to look behind the numbers. And I think that's going to be the heart of it. We know John Brown kills not just slave owners, but people who did not have slaves, but were upholding the idea of slavery, so to speak.
That's where I would push back a little bit, and to sustain some drama, I guess we'll leave our final verdict until the end.
However,
Brown's actions in Kansas don't directly involve, as far as we can tell, known slaveholders. The victims of the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre are definitely advocates for.
That's what I was kind of trying to put the asterisk there of, if not slaveholders, upholding the idea.
Right. But then we're into the realm of political violence, because it means that he's spilling blood on the grounds that the ideas for which they advocate merit death.
In this instance, though.
Right. Which, again, is that it's the old challenge, the old question of what constitutes, being a freedom fighter versus being a terrorist.
Yeah.
One man's riot is another man's protest.
And I think that's been at the heart of when we talked through John Brown was however you want to see him. I think you could make a case for it in his actions. But then you have, so I'm just going to pivot and we'll talk through this a little bit more. But then in comparison, you have Aaron Burr, killed one person, just one person.
That we know
of. One very famous person, Alexander Hamilton of Hamilton fame. But that is not for a greater cause.
The greater cause of Aaron Burr's reputation, his standing in history. But also an act committed at a time when dueling was considered a cultural norm. It was definitely one that was probably poised to vanish. Even Hamilton, who had participated in numerous duels himself and famously lost a son in a duel, Philip, he had begun to make statements about the notion that maybe this was just kind of a barbaric artifact of a past that the new nation should be trying to move away.
It's becoming less popular, but yes, it is still semi-sanctioned violence.
Right, and will continue. Famously, Andrew Jackson was involved in more than 100 duels during his lifetime, and many of them were well after the infamous Burr-Hamilton confrontation.
The Jackson, they did say it would have been curious if Burr and Jackson had dueled because they both had a great shot. Who would have came out on top on that one?
And they were both pretty skinny. They didn't present great targets.
It's one of those things where two of the worst men are fighting. And you're like, I don't care who wins. Oh, God. Do I want? No, I'm not going to say it.
Not going to say what?
Okay, I'm going to alienate our Ohio State listeners. But I'm a Michigan football fan, so when Ohio State plays Michigan State football, you root for the asteroid or the earthquake.
Because we don't like either team.
Yes, right. So the Burr and Jackson thing is
hypothetical Burr-Jackson confrontation.
Similar.
You want them both to deliver a mortal wound to the other.
Yes, but
got it.
I think it's important to talk about the rationale behind Brown and Burr because they are vastly different. They had some similarities growing up, but at the heart of it, at these points in their lives, they make two decisions based on two very different, I don't know what I'm trying to say, ideas of morality. Burr's thinking about, number one, me. Brown, at that point in his life, he was ready to get into some sort of semi-retirement. And he comes out for one last job.
Which turns into two last jobs.
If you want to think of it that way. But then you also have with Aaron Burr, because he goes on, the duel is not at the end of his life. It's been the middle. He gets to go on and commit more things. Maybe not more deaths, but more treason. He certainly is not a good husband to his second wife. So there are other things that are murder, but other things that we can put on that scale.
I'm not sure if this was how you and Jamie intended this particular comparison to work out, but it intrigues me how both men have two curiously similar sort of, what would we call them, exhibits before the court. So Exhibit A and Exhibit B for each man before the court of the, what would we call this?
Ambivalent
the court
offenders.
Of final ambivalent offender podcast judgment. So you have the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre and Harper's Ferry for Brown. Then you have Burr's duel with Hamilton. And then
whatever the fuck he was trying to do.
Yeah, the quote unquote treason plot. And then there are some curious little, I guess we'd call them tangential connections between the two men, in the sense that Burr did make some critical statements in his life on slavery. Obviously, he was not nearly as vocal in his opposition or as activist in his opposition as Brown. But there are some historians who argue that compared to Hamilton, maybe Burr had a more modern outlook on how savage and damning, the continued existence of that institution was in the infant United States, because there is some scholarship that indicates Hamilton helped broker the sale of a slave for a relative.
Hamilton,
That doesn't work its way into the musical, but
how could you?
It's there.
But and you wonder if that's because Brown and Burr, obviously slightly different time periods. Burr's a little bit before Brown, but sort of that puritanical. They do grow up in similar-ish household, academic household.
Although relative to Hamilton, Burr isn't willing to be particularly public in his opposition, whereas Hamilton does participate in some New York manumission societies. And then the other flip side, before I forget, would be if you're just fishing for things in the water that might be magnets on the line to draw the two together. Technically, I almost feel like I should push my glasses up and say, actually, but the charge that Burr is brought up on, which is treason, is the same charge that Brown is brought up on. Although one subtle difference, Brown's charge is treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, as opposed to the nation as a whole.
So where do you come down? I think we're pretty similar in terms of what we're thinking.
Okay, I'm going to say that I am not probably as hard on Burr as you are.
Why? Why aren't you as hard?
We've kind of had this argument from the beginning of his appearance in the podcast.
Because he's a man.
I feel that I'm not telling you where I come down relative to the whole Burr versus Brown question, but just on the subject of Aaron Burr, I feel that his misadventures in the Southwest about the potential of detaching Mexico, or what we now consider Texas, West Florida, all of the land that touches what I would consider to be the Gulf of Mexico, but perhaps it has some other name now, at least maybe not in the
Don't do it, Matt.
Not in the eyes of the rest of the world.
No, don't do it. Don't do it.
That kind of freebooting, as it was called, the filibuestro movement, that has a lot of Jeffersonian roots. Andrew Jackson did. We talk about how Andrew Jackson got wind of Burr's plot and he walks away from it and thinks it might be some form of it
smells like treason to me.
Yeah, walks like a duck, talks like a duck.
If it's treason,
but after the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, Jackson takes the army into Florida, which is Spanish territory at the time, and he does it without the blessing of the federal government.
I'm going to push back, but it's on behalf of the federal government. Burr's looking for something different.
This is where it's speculative, but this is where Burr's defenders, the Burr apologists, would say, is it possible that his ultimate ambition was to create a kind of border republic that would ultimately be subsumed back into the United States in much the same way that Texas, under the empresarios like Stephen Austin, it went through the fiction of, this is in the mid-1820s to 1836. The white settlers of Texas entertained the fiction that they're going to attempt to integrate into Mexican society and embrace Roman Catholicism and learn Spanish and eventually, cough, cough, abandon enslaved labor.
Oh, sure.
Right. I think there's a fear of everybody involved on the Mexican side of that equation as early as 1821, 1822, that no, they're going to come across the border at our invitation because we can't stop them. And they're not really going to try to integrate into our post-colonial republic. They're going to create their own splinter society and try and reattach themselves to the United States. And a similar thing happens with the Bear Flag Republic in California. Jefferson anticipated that this would happen a lot.
I think I could understand that if I didn't know enough about Burr's disposition, who he was as a man, and enough that we know that he was very intrigued by. He wanted blood ties. He wanted to be an emperor. He wanted to pass it on to his grandson. I don't think that sounds like a man who's ready to conquer for himself and then gladly give it back to the United States.
You're saying that I'm presenting this vision where he becomes
a different person.
Yeah, right. Burr becomes the mechanism for these post-colonial border republic territories to be created, carved out of Spanish territory or French territory or British territory. And then I think you could argue he wants to see himself as like the catalyst for them becoming part of Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. And you're putting up a red flag and saying, hold on, his own ego is not going to allow for the baton to be handed.
It's about power, because as soon as he hands that back, the reason he's doing this in the first place is because he can't get elected to anything after the duel. So I have a hard time thinking that even if he created something, that he's going to hand it back, knowing that there's nothing for him there.
I think that's fair. I'm going to give him I'm going to make one more argument in his favor.
Okay.
In that Jeffersonian era, where Jefferson forbids his face to be put on coins, he doesn't allow for public celebrations of his birthday.
Can we just say, fuck Thomas Jefferson? And can we all collectively agree to that?
I'm not going to say that, but I am going to say that, this is a man who, when you look at his shoes, refuses to wear buckles because they're usually made out of silver or gold for people of his station. And so he has strings on his shoes.
Playing the everyman.
Well, right. And so this is where I think some of Burr's defenders would say, well, at least Burr is honest about the fact that he has this trajectory of ambition in service of his own fame and notoriety, bearing in mind that notoriety has shades of darkness for his reputation, I guess. But at least there's a kind of transparency. You know what you're getting with Burr, whereas some of his contemporaries try to very artfully, they try and present this kind of shadow box version of themselves where their own ambition is made to be a myth when we all know it's very concretely involved in every particle of their being.
I think that's very true. I think Jefferson's more ambitious than he puts on in terms of his airs and what we give him credit for. But I don't think that Burr's always transparent either, because that was part of the reason people didn't want to vote for him. And he didn't have much friends in the Senate. He was so unpredictable that he would, he voted against John Jay being the ambassador to Great Britain, I believe, even though he was a friend of Jay, and people are like, well, what are you doing? I think in some ways his ambition's transparent, but not always what comes out of it or what he's doing. I think that it still made people scratch their heads.
Yeah, I would argue that he's not capable of
consistency
or connecting his own goals to those of the Republic. Right? That's kind of his fatal flaw.
He fought in the Revolutionary War, but it wasn't about ideals to him. It was a means to an end. He saw all these other people going and fighting, and he said, I want in on that. I don't want to be left out. It was more FOMO versus and less, I think that we need to break away from Great Britain because of XYZ.
Again, if I wanted to be difficult.
You're always difficult.
We see Hamilton. He risks his life at the Battle of Yorktown in October of 81, which is one of the reasons why he certainly had no reason to duel, to authenticate that he was courageous or anything. Everybody knew that.
Same with Burr.
Right.
Burr in the Battle of Quebec.
Right. But 6 years later, Hamilton is in Philadelphia recommending that the United States establish a monarchy. So if he really embraces the spirit of social contract and representative government.
Hey, there's no bad ideas of brainstorming. You as a teacher know that.
I know. I think what we're building towards here is we both feel like Burr here is not going to come out as well as Brown.
I think there are a lot of things to admire about Burr. Yeah, he was a courageous soldier. Talked about its frankly bizarre mission with him disguised as a priest and how well that turned out. He was a great father, a great husband, at least to Theodosia, not to a second wife.
Encouraged her education at a time when that was considered controversial for some.
But I think that's such a low bar. I think there's so many people who wouldn't even fit on our show, who are just frankly villains who love their family. It's easy to love your family. It's everything else. It's the naked ambition. It's killing Hamilton and not even feeling remorse about it. I get that duels are technically legal-ish in New Jersey.
Not in New York.
But to not at least feel like this is somebody I've known for decades, even if you don't like them, you've known them, to not feel just the slightest tinge of remorse, just go about your day. And then the treason stuff, which we've already talked about. There was something so slippery and slimy about Aaron Burr that it makes him very hard to like. There are some things that you can admire, and I love that he loved to learn. I love that he knew how many languages, including Swedish and Russian. I love that he loved Mary Wollstonecraft, but does that outweigh innate selfishness at the heart of Aaron Burr? I don't think so.
Or does his innate selfishness just foreshadow a time when that would be considered the norm for anyone who wanted to be a public figure? It's not like selfishness is being discouraged contemporary American life.
No. That's what we say. I do feel he is a very modern man in an age where sometimes I'm sure you have students where Jefferson and Madison, they might not be people that they really can see in contemporary life. I think Burr, you could. I think there are so many things about Burr that you could be like, okay, yeah, he's wearing some funny clothes, but you put him in modern day life, and I understand him.
Although that implies that, modern is good, and it's, every generation is.
No, well, I don't. In this case, I'm not saying modern's good.
Right. You're arguing history's not a straight line.
No, I'm using, there are things about him that stand out. We want him to be selfless in a selfless age, but we know that that's not true. I know that that's an idealized version of the Revolutionary period.
Right. And I think, again, that maybe with the exception of Washington, who definitely was ambitious earlier in his life, but at the end, I think he's one of the few people, or in the early republic, we'll say, he's one of the few political figures for whom it's not pretend when he says, I really would prefer to remain a private citizen. Mm-hmm. I think I've done my time. I'd like to go home to Virginia.
He's Diocletian. He just wants to spend time on his cabbages.
Right. Or, as every Ohio State fan would point out, he's Cincinnatus. He's the general who walks away from the army.
Why is it Ohio State? Oh,
Cincinnati.
Makes me like him a little bit less. I'm just kidding. If you guys are fans from Ohio, I love you. Just don't love your team.
It's a football. All right. So there, I think we've probably put Burr up on the show.
Yes.
So now we switch over to
Brown.
All right. So we're going to give, I think, if I have to choose, Brown, to me, is obviously more redemptive because he attaches his life to the cause of equality and freedom. And although that Thomas Aquinas rubric for a just war, which can be kind of a toilsome
pause
spaghetti tangle.
If you're wanting to hear more of that, Matt and I did a episode on Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah, the one where I messed up my geography for
That's
about
okay.
5 minutes.
That's okay.
The southeast and southwest switch. But you know what? Now that it's the Gulf of America,
Doesn't matter.
yeah, all the rivers are emptying into the same place. But anyway, right. So I'll rehash that real quick.
Sure.
There is a famous piece of Christian scholarship, just theological investigation by Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages about how can bloodshed be justified? And he has this rubric for when a war is just. And it includes the notion that a war has to be undertaken when every other peaceful alternative has been exhausted, and the conflict has to be waged under the banner of legitimate authority. And since there's likely to be unexpected casualties, including potentially civilians, you should try to do everything you can to minimize their suffering. And you certainly should make sure that you have a reasonable chance of winning the war if there's going to be collateral damage. So we untangled that in our podcast on Brown, and we argued, I think, that, well, he checks some of those boxes, but not others. Since that time, in thinking about it, I guess I would point out that just as we drew that distinction between Burr's duel with Hamilton and the plot in the Southwest, the old Southwest, Burr is not in New Mexico.
No, not yet.
He's in the old.
He would have loved, though.
He's aspiring to be in the old Southwest.
If he could have gotten to Arizona,
right.
If he could have been emperor in Arizona, he'd love it.
So in the case of Brown,
maybe just a little hot.
Right. Yeah, he probably would have been a little bit surprised by that. Yeah. So for Brown, you've got Potawatomi in the middle of the 1850s, and then you've got the Harper's Ferry raid in what's now West Virginia, at the time Virginia, in the fall of 1859. And the Potawatomi Creek massacre is a harder thing to justify because we don't even have direct evidence that his victims, like the Doyles, were explicitly involved in the militia violence that the anti-slavery settlers experienced.
So, for example, it would be like going into California, executing people because they're in California and you think they're Democrat. Like, loosely, that would kind of be like. Sort of.
Well, yeah, except now I'm going to argue against myself and say this is no ordinary political affiliation. Though,
yes.
Because this is a political affiliation where you feel human beings can be held as property, and
we know that
children can be ripped from their parents.
Yes, Brown doesn't just believe this. In the episode Jamie talked about, he's talking the talk and walking the walk.
And as he talks the talk, whispering in his ear, in his opinion, is the voice of God.
Yes.
So I think the Potawatomi Creek violence is a harder thing to justify. Now, when you look at Harper's Ferry, I think most observers of Harper's Ferry at the time in the North thought it was
ill-conceived.
It was either, I don't know if it's courageously stupid or stupidly courageous or
a little bit of both.
Right. There just seems to be a kind of lunacy at the heart of it that, some of the very famous people that he reaches out to, including we talked about Frederick Douglass.
And Emerson was supportive.
Right. But his actual mission, he thought that if he could get under cover of darkness, if he could get his hands on the requisite number of weapons and ammunition and start moving from slaveholding property to slaveholding property, that it would gather momentum and enslaved Black men and women would do something in 59 and 60 that might require guerrilla warfare and retreat into the
I don't think
into the Blue Ridge
he wasn't
Mountains,
Pollyanna
the Shenandoah
about it.
Valley, and well, even in a strange sort of way, there's a big debate in Civil War scholarship about where do we lay responsibility for emancipation? Where do we put the credit for that?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big body of scholarship that says it's not the Emancipation Proclamation. It might not even be the 13th Amendment. It might not even be the Union Army. That ultimately emancipation is about self-emancipation. It's Black men and women seizing the opportunity raised by the tumult of the war, the dislocation of the war, the chaos of the war, seizing the moment to grab freedom and never let it go. And to that extent,
that's exactly what
he's a dress rehearsal for that. He's just appearing on stage.
We already talked about
earlier.
Brainstorming. Yeah, maybe if he had gone back to the drawing board and brainstormed a little bit harder.
Right, that maybe we would tell a different story about him. On the other hand, what makes him courageous in the eyes of his defenders is that he's doing this in a time where there's enormous socioeconomic and cultural pressure not to do what he's doing. We always like to pretend that if we could inhabit the 19th century ourselves, well, we would be abolitionists.
Yes.
We would join the Liberty Party.
Just like every person thinks they have supported Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s.
Right. His Martin Luther King Jr.'s approval rating in the year of his assassination was very low. It goes up after he's gone. You see this a lot. I think that's the challenge with Brown is it's one of timing. But overall, given, the justice that is informing the sense of justice that informs his mission, of the two, I'm going to come down in his favor.
And he was willing to die for it.
What's strange, I guess, is that everyone who's ever explored the John Brown story points out that the Potawatomi Creek attack has obviously a kind of improvisational religious zeal to it, where the thunderstorm cracks across the sky. He has his chat with God, and then they begin marching from cabin to cabin like men possessed. Mm-hmm. Right. And then so that one seems to have sort of a kind of maniacal quality that maybe matches up more with the Kansas mural painting, Tragic Prelude, than the Hovenden painting we talked about. Mm-hmm. And then at Harper's Ferry, initially, Raid is, like you said, kind of ill-conceived. The first person to die, a free Black man.
Yep. Jamie talked about that in the episode.
I believe his name was Newby, Dangerfield Newby. But once Brown is taken into custody, suddenly he's contemplative, he's cerebral, he's in command. He has this kind of almost stoic Moses down from the mountain after the angry outburst over the golden calf. And now he's just solemnly saying, I am convinced that the crimes of this guilty land cannot be purged, but with blood. Mm-hmm. And obviously, those are words that we now say, okay, you were a prophet, and your prophecy was about more than trying to create Aaron Burr territorial expansion theme park
for my grandson
in the old Southwest. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was thinking about something bigger than himself.
Yeah, and I don't want to discount the fact that people died at his hand. I think you've done a good job of saying whether or not that was justified. Probably not. But I think if you put him up against Aaron Burr, he's representing something greater than himself, something that will be greater than himself, and that will be so great it consumes a nation.
And I'm sure that's the last sort of odd connection between the two, which is that it would be wonderful if we could tell ourselves a story that as soon as we established the United States as an independent republic, untethered from the British Empire, we tackled this slavery question, because we knew that this existence of slavery within our new social contract was just a damning damning condemnation. It was a hypocrisy that would just boil us away. But we didn't. It took about 60 years. And
procrastinated, like me with many things.
Well, right. And what ultimately brings it to the forefront is sadly not the ethical dimension of enslavement and the immorality of it. It's the question of its expansion. Well, what does it mean for our future economically? And that also then circles you right back to people like Burr, because 30 years, 40 years before the term manifest destiny ever fell from an American's lips, he was trying to do these little adventure missions.
He was manifesting his destiny.
He was manifesting his destiny. And I think if we're being honest, Jefferson was on board for that, so long as it would ultimately be attached to the United States, which shows you that whole generation has this question before them of, do we focus on ambition, expansion, territorial growth? Right? You can call it the empire of liberty, but what word are you emphasizing there? Is it empire? Is it liberty? Or do we stop and take a beat and confront the fact that this institution of slavery that we thought was on death's doorstep is certainly by the 1820s, it's growing in a way that indicates it's going to have to be reckoned with.
Wow.
So is that okay?
Yes, that's a lot. Thank you so much for joining us. Jamie's going to record her own opinion. I'm going to put it into the podcast right here.
Welcome, Jamie.
This is Jamie. I'm going to pop in with just a short judgment. I could go on and on about this, obviously. In comparison of Aaron Burr and John Brown, I think that John Brown is the more righteous one than Aaron Burr. So I would give John Brown, I would give him probably about a 70-30. I would give Aaron Burr like a 60-40. And I think that big difference between the two, even though both killed, so both committed murder, you could say Brown committed more murder. I think it really comes down to that belief system, that idea that, to quote Hamilton, Burr, you stand for nothing. We know John Brown, throughout his entire life, showed a commitment to the abolition movement and to freeing slaves and really trying to destroy slavery across the entire United States. His plan was dumb and it ended up killing innocent people, but he also showed mercy. For example, when the train stopped, he didn't kill everybody on the train. When he was going through the different houses after the people in Potawatomi were massacred, spared the wives, he spared the older sons, and even went to some a house where the men were not involved at all in the pro-slavery movement, so he let them live. I don't think he was just indiscriminate killing. As I said, because it was something that wasn't just Harper's Ferry. This was something that he believed, again, with Elba, moving there to help this Black community, really being, I would say, committed for life about that anti-slavery. And in comparison, Burr, right, he sits in the middle in Congress. That tells us everything, right? He runs on no platform. He has no journals or anything about the Revolutionary War. We know he fights later, and I'll give him credit for that. But I think it's a lot harder to cheer and give credit to somebody who doesn't have those strong convictions, at least, especially until maybe later when it's politically advantageous. For example, going to George Washington and thinking he should be higher up because he was born into a higher class family. I don't know how much of the Democratic Republic that was really driving Burr. So I think Brown outweighs Burr for sure, not just because I did Brown, but that's my opinion. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for listening to Ambivalent Offenders. We will be back soon with a brand new episode now that our Dueling Villains series is over. As always, like, subscribe, review, as long as you say nice things, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can get more information, more episodes over on our Patreon page. All of that is linked in the description. And thank you guys for listening. And thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Bye.
Bye.